this time around, I mean, I'm 77 years old. I'm still kicking. I'm still going to do photography of the upcoming political stuff. But I just can't stand back and watch my country go down the tube. And too many people are doing that.
Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Mona Charon, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I'm joined by two of our regulars, Bill Galston of the Wall Street Journal and the Brookings Institution, and Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center. Damon Linker is out this week, but joining us in his place is Bill Kristol, who is editor-at-large at the Bulwark, and we're delighted to have him. And our special guest this week is David Hume Kennerly, who is a wonderful photographer who has been at the heart of American political life for 50 years. He won the Pulitzer Prize at the age of 25, which is almost obscene. And he has been in Vietnam, in Pakistan, at the fight of the century between Ali and Frazier. He photographed Donald Trump on election night 2016. So he's kind of been at the forefront. And of course, he did serve as President Gerald Ford's photographer. Now, that is not why we've asked him here this week. We asked him here this week because he did something that is all too rare in American politics these days. He stood up for principle. And so, first of all, thank you all for joining me. And David, I would love if you would explain to our listeners what happened with the Gerald Ford president. Was it the Presidential Foundation? Is that what it is? That was considering giving an award to Liz Cheney. And why don't you pick it up from there?
So I had been a trustee of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation for, I don't know how many years, 20 years maybe. I was like the last person you'd ever expect to see on a board of anything. But so just fast forward, we can nominate for the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Medal of Public Service anybody we like. I wasn't on the nominating committee, but any trustee could put up a name. And so this last time around, I put up Liz Cheney as a very deserving person for that award. And the award for public service honors people who show strength and integrity, and that really mirrors who Gerald Ford was. And I probably knew him as well or better than most people because I served as his chief White House photographer. I was with him every day of his presidency on Air Force One in the Oval Office. We were very close. I was close with him and the whole family. But this year was so critical, I think, to honor Liz Cheney by that group. I mean, she represents everything that Ford stood for, and they were just afraid to do it. And basically, the nominations went to the nominating committee, and then the executive committee of 12 different people made the decision on who it would be. And only one of those people, by the way, had ever served in the White House. I mean, I was 27 when I was Ford's chief White House photographer till the end. I was just before I hit 30 years old. One of the reasons I'm still around, obviously, is I was one of the younger people, like Henry Kissinger, all these other people on the board. Many of them are retired or passed away. And I'm kind of the last of the good old days. It's hard to imagine. But so they decided to they picked somebody else for it, a former president, and this really wasn't about them. And then he ended up not being able to do it for whatever reason, and they gave it to somebody else who declined, I think, because of scheduling. So it opened up again for the third time. And I really went to the wall for Liz. I said, look, you've got to do this. I mean, there's no other choice really. And so they ended up not, I guess they passed on that idea again and picked Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana, who's, a nice guy. I mean, but this is not a nice guy award. This is an award for people who stood up. And Mitch, although he disagreed with a lot of the Trump stuff, really never stepped up. I mean, he agreed with Biden on a couple of things. And again, I'm not attacking him, and I guess he's going to get the award and accept it, and so I quit. I said, that's it. I can't be a part of an organization that doesn't have the guts to do the right thing, which is in my estimation.
So one of the things that you said in this quite blistering resignation letter, which will put...
Don't ever mess with photographers. That's the bottom line.
I will put this in the show notes because it's well worth a read. You didn't pull your punches. You said a key reason Liz's nomination was turned down was your agita about what might happen if the former president is reelected. Some of you raised the specter of being attacked by the Internal Revenue Service and losing the foundation's tax-exempt status as retribution for selecting Liz for the award. The historical irony was completely lost on you. Can you elaborate?
Well, I mean, as Bill Kristol and the rest of you know, Richard Nixon was weaponizing the IRS to go after his enemies. And it was just that kind of thinking. I think it boiled down to, people have asked me what the real problem was. And I said it was a 4-letter word starting with F, fear. The fear of Trump, fear of all the things that might happen. And, Gerald Ford was served heroically in World War II. He was a gunnery officer. His aircraft carrier shot down over, I think, like 18 Japanese planes that were attacking them. And I don't think Gerald Ford was doing that because he knew he wouldn't get killed. He did it despite that. And it's that kind of courage that's lacking in the United States today. And I've heard all of you talk about it. And it's particularly among Republicans. I used to be one, believe it or not, although I'm not a political party person anymore. But I think people go to behind closed doors and they rail against Donald Trump and all that, and then they don't say anything. And and there are those who support him full-throated support of Trump and company. But, as somebody, I grew up in a small town, Roseburg, Oregon, which is a very conservative part of the state. But I was always, I was kind of like a Mark Hatfield, Gerald R. Ford Republican. They don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And Gerald Ford would probably be a rhino, according to some of these people. And Mark Hatfield, forget it. He'd be a left-wing Democrat. But so those are the kind of people that I looked up to, and they're all gone. I mean, I think the Republican Party has deteriorated into a bunch of yes people. I mean, Kristol would know this. How many people are on the list that want to be Trump running mates? I noticed that story this morning that Rubio is not showing up with his red tie at the court and all that. He wants to be the quiet guy who will be picked, but that's what we've got. And
yeah, just out of curiosity, did you see this in evidence on the board? Were people quiet, behind the scenes saying that they really, didn't like Trump and so on, but then when it came time to honor Liz Cheney, they got, yellow, as we used to say?
The executive committee made the final choice. And I don't know if some of them are Trump supporters or what. And one of the problems I have, because of COVID was one of the issues, obviously, we didn't get together physically once a year like we used to. So I don't know a lot of the people. But interestingly, the 5 people who served in the Ford administration were supportive of me, and Liz, more important. And so I don't know. She's a symbol to me. I've known her since she was 8 years old. You couldn't find more political courage if you looked for it than what she represents. Adam Kinzinger as well, who served on the committee, the J6 committee. I just know her really well. I know her dad's one of my best friends. I mean, I normally wouldn't have brought that up in Santa Monica where I was living, but so, but he's made this whole.
He was chief of staff for Ford, right?
Yeah, he was chief of staff. Obviously, later became Darth Vader when he was the vice president of the United States. But I've always stayed close to the Cheney family. I love them a lot, and so and it's not about that though. It's about political courage, and you just don't see it anymore. And I think this is like a symptomatic of that. And I'm not a political person. I don't campaign for anybody. I've never worn a political campaign button or anything like that in my life. But this time around, I mean, I'm 77 years old. I'm still kicking. I'm still going to do photography of the upcoming political stuff. But I just can't stand back and watch my country go down the tube. And too many people are doing that.
One last thing from me, and then I'll open it up from everyone else. So you were with Trump on election night 2016. Is that right?
Yeah, that was one of the more bizarre experiences in my life. I mean, I've photographed every president since LBJ, including Biden, since he's become president. Some of them I've known better than others. My list of political coverage is pretty extensive. And my archive, by the way, is now at Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona. And they have all my stuff, which I'm still adding to. I'm not quitting. And I suppose that that night, and I would have covered Hillary. I know Hillary pretty well. She's also a 1947 person. And I've traveled around with her a lot. Think she's an incredibly funny person. And, I voted for her, no question about that. And but I was in the room at the Hilton, it looked to me like it was a setup by somebody who didn't think he was going to win, which is probably the case. It didn't want to pay a lot of money, where Hillary had the whole Javits Center. I mean, talk about blowing a bunch of cash. But and so when it was announced that Trump won, and they came out, him and the whole family and Mike Pence and everybody, and it was more like a wake. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. Usually when people win, they're overjoyed. And I don't know that Donald Trump has had a joyful moment in his life, to be honest with you, but that wasn't one of them. And my pictures from that evening are really strong and showed probably one of the most peculiar evenings in American political history.
So interesting. Okay. Well, any thoughts or observations or questions from the rest of the group?
Can I just ask one? This is a brief question. I'm just curious. David, is the photo, which I happened to see recently for some reason, maybe you posted it, of President Ford playing like patty cake or something with the 8-year-old, I take it, Liz Cheney. Is that your photo from Camp David in 70 when he was president, right? So that's like 70.
Yeah, that was at Camp David. He had the Cheneys up. And I went up every weekend with the president to Camp David. And
It's really cute. People should take a look at it. I mean, it's really, but it does bring home the point that you made in passing that it's not, I mean, Liz Cheney deserved it anyway. And she got awards from many, many institutions that are 501c3 tax exempt institutions. And there was not a threat to their tax status. Freedom House gave her an award. The Kennedy Library in Boston gave her an award. But there was a connection here. It's a little more of a family connection, you might say, but it was appropriate, I guess is the way I would say it, for the Ford Foundation, Gerald Ford Foundation, to honor Liz Cheney because there was that long-standing personal and family connection.
Well, and to that point, and this is what the foundation put out their rationale was if you're a candidate for office, you can't support them or go against them either way. But the fact is, Liz never declared her candidacy, and it's really a clear thing. And I had a couple lawyers look at it because I'm definitely not one of those. But they said unless you're a candidate, which is a whole series of things you have to do. I mean, it's almost like a legal definition. But so that was chicken, and I excised the last half of that word. But it was that really bugged me because they were not even overly cautious. It was just the plain out didn't want to give her the award for the reasons I stated. But
it was a pretext.
Not a candidate. And the Camp David moment was playing "Here's the Church" and "Here's the Steeple," and I thought Liz is, by the way, is a lawyer who went to Chicago Law School, where Ed Levy had been the president of that. He was attorney general for Ford. And she is really smart and she's really funny. She's a great family person. And I mean, I just know her so well and I admire her, and we haven't always agreed on everything, but that doesn't matter.
Bill Galston.
A comment and a request. My comment is that the story you told about what happened on, the Gerald Gerald Ford Foundation board is in microcosm the story of how democracies undermine themselves. It is almost never the case that the people who are spreading fear are strong enough by themselves to attain power. It's the people on the receiving end of the fear signal who succumb to it, who open the door for democratic decline. A lot of very good literature on the subject has been published recently, but you just really captured it. Here's my request. In your letter, your wonderful letter, you told the story of President Ford going to address a group of veterans. I wonder if you would just share that with our audience, because it really spoke to me.
It totally tells you who Gerald Ford was. And it was 10 days after he became president. There was a scheduled. It might have even been a Nixon event scheduled. A lot of stuff, like for instance, King Hussein came to the White House and very shortly after Ford became president. But that had been scheduled during the Nixon time, and he kept the visit. But this was to the Veterans of Foreign Wars in Chicago. And when I was riding in the car with him and Mrs. Ford, he was talking about what he was going to do. He was going to tell them that he believed that there should be leniency for some 50,000 odd people who had gone to Canada or dodged the draft, and maybe Clinton was in this mix. I don't know. But he said, I'm going to tell this group of people, and he was a member of the VFW, that I'm going to, because we need to heal the United States after the Vietnam War, I'm going to tell them of my plan to grant leniency to these people. And he said, the one thing I don't have to worry about is being interrupted by applause. And he could have, his advisor said, look, why don't you go to like a college where everybody will cheer you. And he told the press pool on the way back from on Air Force One that would be an act of cowardice as far as he was concerned, that he needed to tell the people who were not going to like it. And I understand that. He said, they need to hear it from me directly. And if you see the pictures that I shot there was no one clapping. But that's who he was. That was a gutsy move. And I can't think of any other president who would say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go to where people are going to be really mad at me for what I'm proposing. I'm going to go to, Harvard or someplace.
That's character. Linda.
I just wanted to ask David a question because I think it was that shows how old I am. 2021, I was actually invited to be a speaker at the Gerald Ford Foundation and later asked to do a podcast. And so I'm on their list. I see a lot of the speakers who are invited, and they do seem to have a good mix of people. So I'm just wondering, obviously, this was a terrible failure of leadership for them not to give this award to Liz Cheney. I like to call myself today. I used to call myself a Reagan Republican. I call myself a Liz Cheney Republican today.
Yeah, right.
And but I am just wondering, is there some difference in terms of maybe the programming for the Ford Foundation? Because they had Barbara McQuaid speak there recently. She's been, one of the frequent commentators on the Trump legal problems. And when I spoke there, my views on Donald Trump are pretty well known. And it wasn't a secret then. So what is that division? What is the relationship between the board that is, overseeing the foundation and some of the people who actually run?
No, I think they still bring different people in the mix. I mean, if you look at the people who got that award over the years, Colin Powell, Tip O'Neill, it was bipartisan to the degree that, and the way Ford was, that he just appreciated people for who they were. He was a good Republican. I remember early on, and I'm in the Oval Office with him, waiting for an appointment to come in. He was looking at the seal on the Great Seal of the United States on the ceiling of the Oval Office, and he was telling me how he'd been a good Republican all his life. He went into Congress, elected in 48, and then he looked at me and he said, I've never asked you, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And then he said, don't answer that. And but he didn't care. He didn't care, and that's really the way you should be. And because he was always on the minority side of the aisle, he had to work across the aisle to get stuff done that he wanted to get done. And so did Ronald Reagan. I mean, Tip O'Neill and Ford, I believe Tip was the majority leader when Ford was president. Carl Albert was the speaker. But during the Reagan administration, Tip O'Neill and Reagan collaborated to revamp Social Security. It was the Greenspan Commission. And there was way more of that, but it was that spirit. That's what we need in the country. That people do have to work together. But boy, I'll tell you, even my home state of Oregon, all those counties along the Idaho line want to become part of Idaho. Yeah. They don't think they're being properly represented by all the libs in the Portland area.
Secession is in the air. All right. Thank you very much for that. And let us turn now from a moment of high principle to today's politics. And let's talk, because as we speak, the jury in New York has the case. They are deliberating. We do not expect any news while we're here, but maybe soon. And let's talk about the political implications here, or about the trial if anybody has feelings they want to express about the actual trial itself. But I wanted to focus on this pivot by the Biden people. So Biden, until now, has sort of kept his distance on the topic of the trial. He hasn't really commented on it or attempted to use it, except for one sort of funny snide comment where he was challenging Trump to debate and, wink, wink, said, I hear you're free on Wednesdays. But other than that, he has kept his distance until yesterday, when Robert De Niro, representing the Biden campaign, and two of the January 6th policemen who were badly injured on January 6th, appeared outside the courtroom and delivered a sort of broadside against Trump. So, Bill Kristol, I'm going to start with you. Was that a mistake, do you think, or was it necessary? And how should the Biden people going forward handle the whole question of the verdict?
I mean, I think the De Niro thing was trolling, really, and I mean, presumably Mr. De Niro and certainly the two Capitol Police wanted to do that. They thought it was important to take advantage of all the press being there, but that wasn't a serious comment, obviously, on the trial. And Biden's been scrupulous in staying out of that side of it, and so I think he's behaved well. I've sort of changed my mind. I've had the view that the trial was unlikely to make much difference, and in any case, Biden's best thing was to stay way out of it, and he should stay out of it, obviously, until there's a verdict. But I think it is. I now think it's more important than I thought it was, if Trump is convicted, which isn't a certain thing, to get the American public to focus on that, even though this isn't the most important of the four cases, and we all would have preferred, I suspect, the January 6th case and the classified documents case to go first and stuff. But look, it will be a true statement that he will be a convicted felon at that point. And I think it's just worth the Biden campaign, maybe not President Biden personally, or maybe it should be associated groups on the outside, really bringing that home to people. Look, if you want to vote for Trump, vote for Trump. But you do need to face the fact that you're voting for someone who is a convicted felon for a real crime that may have affected the 2016 election, and convicted, and this is the key point. James Carville, I did a conversation with him today, it'll be up tomorrow, made this point to me. Very important to stress this over and over. Convicted by a jury of his peers. This was not some of the other stuff that everyone's talking about were judges finding things in civil cases, right? There weren't jury trials and all that. And so people think, oh, well, there's some judge who doesn't like Trump, or this is a jury. Now you can say it's a Manhattan jury, but it's still a jury. It's a jury that the Trump defense team agreed to. I mean, these were all people, they exercised their ability to strike some jurors, and these were 12 who everyone agreed to. They sat there for 5 weeks, a considerable sacrifice to their own private lives, I take it. They seem to have been, by the accounts I've read, very diligent jurors. We'll see what happens now over the next 2 or 3 days when things get resolved. But I think very important to really force the public to face up to the fact that he was found guilty of this felony by a jury, not just by some liberal judge or, some grand jury where you really don't know much about them or anything like that. And so I guess I do think politically it's important to bring home, maybe it won't make any difference, incidentally, I don't know, but why not remind the public that if he is one, that he will be a convicted felon.
Linda, it goes without saying that if there is an outright acquittal or a hung jury, this will be very advantageous to Trump, who will advertise, certainly with an acquittal, and even with a hung jury, will advertise it as total vindication, blah, blah, blah. But, this does raise the matter that is sort of percolating underneath the surface of everything that we talk about in this election year, namely, how much do voters know? And some people say, well, you can't really move the voters because both of these men have been president and they know everything there is to know, and you can't you can't affect their perceptions. I'm not so sure that's right. I suspect, and I'd love to hear your views, I suspect that for many, many voters, they're aware of that there's a trial going on. They're not sure which one of the four it is. They don't know what exactly he's being tried for. And for many people, their first focus on it will be when the verdict comes. What do you say to that?
Absolutely. There's no question in my mind that people are not paying attention. I regret to say I spent a month of my life glued in front of the television during daytime hours, watching the little scrolling reports from inside the courtroom. But I know that I'm unusual in that, and my children would say a little bit obsessed. But I do think for most people, it isn't really clear. But I think, what Bill said is the most important point. And that is that the whole idea of a country that runs because of the rule of law depends on our honoring our judicial system. We have a system in which people are tried by juries of their peers. And in the case of criminal trials, there has to be unanimity among the jury to find somebody guilty. The way in which the Trump people have tried to undermine confidence in our jury system is truly disgusting and truly dangerous. I think it's one of the most dangerous things that they have done. And, let me remind listeners, this idea that New York City jury is not capable of giving an acquittal because they're too biased. Tom Bulwark, who was one of Trump's big fundraisers, I think he may have been the chair of his inaugural committee, very well known in Republican circles. He was brought up on criminal charges of espionage. He was tried before a jury in New York City, and he was in fact acquitted. So, it just bothers me so much to think that we have now come to the point where you can no longer trust the jury system, the judicial system. They constantly use the phrase that it's been weaponized. Trump himself, even this morning, continuing to cast aspersions on the judge. But the way in which that affects the American people and the corrosion of our civic values, I think that's the single most important thing to come out of this trial. And unless there's acquittal, and I almost bet my life on it, not being an acquittal, not because the jury isn't impartial, but because there is a mountain of evidence. Could be a hung jury, could be a mixed verdict, but the corrosion of our judicial system that this president and his people have been involved in, I think is truly, truly terrible.
They have. They've undertaken to discredit pretty much every institution in American society. And the judiciary is just the latest on a long list that also includes our election system, which is incredibly destabilizing, as we all know. All right. But Bill Galston, you, I know, study public opinion and polling and so on. So there's been a fair amount of polling, most famously from Quinnipiac, showing that some percentage of Trump voters would reconsider if he were convicted of a felony, and a much bigger percentage of independents would reconsider. How seriously do you take polls like that 7 months out before the Trump disinformation engine and the Republican Party's efforts to discredit the result and to make people think that it was all just a witch hunt and political?
Well, may I revise your question? It's barely more than 5 months out.
Oh yeah.
It's almost the beginning of June, folks.
Yeah.
And this is starting to get real.
Yeah.
I am trying, Mona, very hard to distinguish between what I want to be true and what I believe to be true. What I want to be true is exactly what Bill and Linda said. What I fear is true is something different. And I have no idea whether these polls are right or wrong. But I do know this. After Donald Trump had been president for nearly 4 years, he got a higher percentage of the popular vote in November of 2020 than he did in November of 2016. You can look it up. Donald Trump didn't lose the election. Joe Biden won it. And I think that's a very important fact. Not long after January 6th, Trump began his rise in the polls. And he has now, led President Biden For months after months after months, the race has been frozen in both the national polls and in the swing states. I've never seen this kind of deep freeze in American political opinion in all the years I've been looking at it. And this is with full knowledge of what happened on January 6th and everything that's been happening, everything that has been happened since. And so while I don't entirely subscribe to the proposition that the American people remember everything that Donald Trump did in his first term, I'm sure there is a certain amount of Trump amnesia. The proposition that they haven't been exposed to a mountain of negative information since then is contrary to fact. And here he is. Is it possible that an outright conviction in this trial would change people's minds? Of course it's possible. But I have now spent more than 9 years saying to myself time after time, this time he's gone too far. This is surely the straw that will break the back, of the spell that he's cast over the American people. It has never happened. I very much hope that this will be it, but the evidence gives me no confidence that it will be.
David, one of the things that some people have worried about is that if there is a guilty verdict, that Democrats could screw things up by being too jubilant, too triumphalist, expecting too much from it, maybe even get lazy about how to campaign. Do you think they have to be careful about their reaction? Not that anybody can, from on high control people's reactions, but certainly the campaign. What do you think would be the appropriate, grown-up, and politically smart way to respond?
Quiet joy. I don't know. What Joe Biden, and I was never a huge fan of his over the years. I mean, he's kind of a cranky guy. But what was impressive in the last campaign was how he reeled himself in. I mean, he showed incredible discipline, and Kristol does also. I mean, you've seen him out there. There was one appearance where he got into it with some farmer at an event, and that's like the real Joe Biden. But it was a kind of a glancing blow. But I was really impressed by his reserve and because he's very bristly, and he anybody that knows him at all has seen it, privately and sometimes publicly. I think the Democrats should take a cue from that. And to your point, because I think people know. I mean, we've looked at the polls and all that, and what you're seeing is it may not move the needle that much. I don't think we could know. One would hope that would make an impression. But one of the things I worry about is the RFK Jr. campaign. And I'm friends with Carrie, his sister, and, most of that family is like supporting Biden quite openly. And they say, well, it's going to take away from Trump or Biden, and nobody seems to know, which I think is probably right. But his dad, Robert Kennedy, was my inspiration for political photography. And I was also there the night that Robert Kennedy got shot at the Ambassador Hotel, and which was a national tragedy, a personal tragedy. But because of Robert Kennedy, and it was an appearance he made in Portland, Oregon in 1966. I was a 19-year-old cub photographer on the Oregon Journal and was sent to do a rally of his. And I couldn't get into the room where he was speaking. It was a labor hall. And on the outside of the crowd was this photographer who appeared to be traveling with Kennedy. And I went over to him. I said, how do you get into these rooms? And he said, grab onto my coat, Kennedy, cut right through, put me up in a spot where I got the really nice pictures of Kennedy. And then flash forward, I went out to the airport to watch Kennedy take off, and the Senator Kennedy got up and waved goodbye. And then this photographer, who was Bill Epridge of Life magazine, followed him up. The door closed. The plane took off. I felt like uh, Rick in the last scene of Casablanca watching his love flap. And I determined I wanted to be on that plane. It was because of Robert Kennedy, and it was a profound moment. It changed my life. And so when I see his kid doing what he's doing, and with all these wacky theories about, anti-vax stuff and all that, I mean, I grew up, and Linda and I grew up right at the verge of polio being eradicated, but not before I had friends of mine die from it or be crippled by it. And I am wildly pro-vax, and I can't even believe what's happened in this country about that. I'm very emotional about it, and I really get into it with people over that. And Robert Kennedy Jr. has no business being in this race, and I don't know who he's going to affect negatively, but I wish he would get out.
You know, it is amazing that we have become such an idiotic, stupid country where two candidates for president are competing for the anti-vax vote, namely Trump and RFK
really
Jr.
Astonishing. Yeah.
It is just unbelievable. And, now Trump is saying he's going to deny federal funding to schools that mandate vaccines. And, very soon it's going to be witch trials, at the rate we're going.
There will be another pandemic
sometime.
There's always going to be one just over the horizon. And
that's right.
And this last one was botched, and so look, 1 million people died on Donald Trump's watch.
That's right.
I mean, you can't get around that.
That's right. But that's another thing that's driving me completely berserk, is that the lesson that our culture appears to have taken from that experience, where there is no question that Trump's incompetence and then politicizing of things like mask wearing and taking vaccines caused the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. We lost more people in this country than any of our peer nations did because of Trump's incompetence and venality. And yet, what is the lesson that everybody appears to have taken from COVID? It's just that, some people kept things closed too long, and admittedly, keeping the schools closed was a huge, huge mistake. But where is the countervailing focus on, take ivermectin and, inject yourself with bleach and the rest of it? I mean, it is just, sometimes I think we've lost our capacity for self-government. But let's move on to, sorry for that rant.
I'm up to date on all my shots, by the way. I think I'm on number 7 now or whatever.
Yeah, I've had so many. I'm not even sure. I haven't gotten the most recent COVID one, but it's on my list. It's on my to-do list. All right. Let's also, though, I'd like if we could spend a few minutes on something that is not getting a lot of attention, but maybe it will begin to, because people are starting to comb through the election data or the polling data anyway, and they're seeing something interesting, which is, we know that Biden is weak among young voters. That's clear. But Ron Brownstein and others at CNN and other places have been noticing that Biden is actually doing quite well, or better than he is in any other group, with people over the age of 65, with seniors. So he has an advantage with two groups: college-educated white people and people over the age of 65. What do those two groups have in common? They are incredibly reliable voters. And so, Bill, does the Democratic Party, is this an opportunity for them to sort of reevaluate their usual get out the vote scheme, where they think the more the better among Latinos and among minority men and so on, and youth, should they maybe begin to think, no, if we can goose up some of those senior votes, maybe, and, college educated whites, we can compensate for his lack of enthusiasm among young voters, because young voters and voters of color are less likely to vote.
I find myself agreeing with your conclusion, but not with all of your premise. And let me explain. I think the evidence is pretty clear, that the two parties have flipped in the past generation or so. That, the previous assumption was that Democrats would attract the less committed and less likely voters, and so a high turnout was automatically better for them, and vice versa for the Republicans, who commanded the loyalty of more educated, more upscale voters, and therefore would gain an advantage if only the reliable voters showed up or the reliable voters dominated. Because of demographic changes in the political parties, especially the reversal of their standing with regard to college educated people, and by the way, people making more than $100,000 a year are now predominantly Democrats as opposed to Republicans. So I do think there's some truth to the generalization that the Republicans are more the party of the working class than they used to be, and perhaps more than the Democrats are, and vice versa, and therefore that a voting pool filled with the most reliable voters would be better for Democrats. But that's the conclusion that I agree with. The factual premise, though, is that that it's clear that young people are fading in their support for Biden, and that older people are flocking to him. So just out of curiosity, I went to the latest Economist YouGov poll, and in the head-to-head competition, here are the age breakdowns. 18 to 29, 46 for Biden, 26 for Trump. 30 to 44, 39, 35. 45 to 64, 41, 44. And 65 and older, 36 for Biden, 51 for Trump. Now, I'm not saying that we should believe that poll more than others. What I am saying is that at this point, I think it would be wise to reserve judgment on how much of a change in the age breakouts there's going to be when we count the votes this November as opposed to November of 4 years ago. One more comment. Why might it be the case that it might turn out that older voters are more pro-Biden than younger voters? Here's my answer. Older voters are much better insulated against inflation and high interest rates than young voters are. Voters who are on Social Security for a substantial portion of their income get an automatic inflation adjustment every year. American workers don't. They used to, but they don't. And older voters are disproportionately likely to own their homes outright without mortgages, and therefore are much less affected by interest rates. And they also have a lower propensity to accumulate credit card debt than especially young families do. So if it works out that older voters are on Biden's side at the end, relatively speaking, it will be, I believe, because of the different impact of inflation and high interest rates on their voting calculus.
I would just add to that, Bill, that all the things you just mentioned, and in addition, higher interest rates deliver greater dividends on savings, which elderly people usually have more of than young people. So that's another way in which they are in a softer situation than perhaps some young people. So Bill Kristol, Biden has some things up his sleeve. The Biden people are looking forward to September 1st, 2024, when they are going to announce the results of this negotiation to lower drug prices on a series of about 10 drugs that are commonly used by elderly people. And he's already capped insulin to $35 a month, which is a big help for about 1.5 million Medicare recipients. And so they are doing things with government power to make life easier for elderly voters. But what about the things that they're doing to appeal to young voters? Two of them I'm dubious about. One is forgiving student loans, which I think is bad policy and bad politics, and loosening the regulations on pot. What do you think of those?
I mean, the student loan thing helps some people and annoys others who paid for college or paid off their loans already, or don't see why Harvard graduates who are going to do very well, even though they're now in debt, should be helped by the government when they saved up to go to community college, got a 2-year degree, and are working very hard as a pharmacist or something. So, I mean, these are
or
much
didn't
more
go to college at all.
Yeah, these are much more cross-cutting, these policies. I mean, insulin, some of them are pretty straightforward. If you're helping people cap their drug prices, it's hard to see. I mean, there may ultimately be some cost to be paid for that from a sort of, pure economic analysis point of view, but that's probably more of a straightforward thing politically. But I mean, I just make 2 quick points. One, I've just been, this conversation I had with Carville got me depressed even more than I normally am. I mean, the Biden campaign just seems incapable of delivering these messages, if I could just be honest and straightforward. I mean, they have plenty to say, but they either sound defensive or they say one thing one day and then it's another speech on a different topic 2 days later. I mean, I wrote about this week in terms of foreign policy, which maybe isn't an issue that people care about. But on the other hand, you have West Point, then Memorial Day. He's going to speak on June 6th in Normandy. There's a 2-week window there where obviously Biden, those 3 speeches will be nonpartisan and non-political. As David said, though, he's good at, he's gotten good at, I think, it's staying above the fray in that way. But the Biden campaign could spend 2 weeks saying, do we want a serious, responsible steward of our role in the world, someone who cares about veterans, someone who respects the military, or do we want Trump? And here are 9,000 examples of Trump, with John Kelly and so forth and so forth. That would be a totally appropriate thing for the campaign to do. It would be a 2-week thing. It wouldn't be huge, but I think it would be a helpful message. I get the feeling that weirdly, and this is just politics 101. I mean, they don't even sort of think of, well, let's have a 2-week message on this, and then let's do the drug stuff for 2 weeks or something. And June is very important. I mean, September's late. Voting begins at the end of September. People's impressions settle in over the summer. The conventions are going to be whatever they are, but I don't know that they get just kind of bottles, sort of takes up a lot of space without necessarily changing anyone's mind. I feel like June is a really important month, culminating in that debate, if it happens, on June 27th, where Biden needs to lay the predicate for certain things that he can then points he can make strongly in the debate, and really, that will be when people tune in. They may not pay much attention to the New York verdict, they may not pay much attention to even his speech on June 6th in Normandy, but if that debate happens, Biden needs to really take advantage of it. I hope they're preparing for that. And I hope they need to start talking about it a lot so Trump can't back out of it, which I believe he'll do, incidentally, if he's ahead by 3-4 points at that point and figures it's not in his interest. He'll invent a million reasons to get out of it. And the Biden people need to lay that down ahead of time. One tiny footnote on the age thing, which is complicated. Biden is relatively doing less well among young voters, minority voters, and so forth than 2020. He's still winning them in most, things. And therefore, even if you're doing relatively less well, if you win some, let's say, youth vote by 20 points, the more than the vote, the better. I mean, assuming that the vote is, not differentiated between your supporters and the ones who are against you. But it's very hard to write if you just do the math. Biden needs, I think, a substantial turnout of young voters. It's just he needs to run up some numbers among young voters, even if he's running them up 60-40 instead of 65-35, still the more people in a group that's going 60-40 for you that vote, the better you are. So I think the erosion, especially among Hispanic voters, somewhat among blacks, especially black men, younger black men, and among young voters, is dangerous. He can make it up somewhat with older voters and maybe suburban women and so forth, but it's something they need to focus on.
Linda, picking up on something that Bill said about the Biden campaign, do you get the feeling there is a Biden campaign right now?
That's exactly what I was sitting here thinking, Mona, and I was thinking back to our time in the Reagan White House. In the Reagan White House, there was a coordinated effort to pull everybody together, not just in the White House, but in the various cabinets, to focus on issues for, as Bill suggested, a couple of weeks at a time. And the message, there would be a coordinated message that would go out. It would be President Reagan on the road. He would go to, various cities. There'd be national speeches, national campaigns. You just don't get that sense with Biden. Yes, he has been going out and giving speeches sporadically around the country in important places, but they're sort of scattershot. And, I keep thinking, has somebody sat down and said, these are the 4 or 5 issues that we are going to run on, and this is going to be our theme, and this is how we are going to approach it? We can't do everything. We can't cover every issue in under the sun, but we've got to do it in a very coordinated fashion. And while, the Hatch Act prevents people in the administration from actually campaigning, it doesn't prevent cabinet secretaries from going out and giving speeches or doing events or emphasizing the work they're doing on a given issue. And I don't see that. Maybe I'm not paying close enough attention. Maybe Bill can correct me, or one of the two Bills can correct me. But my sense is that we don't have that kind of strategic thinking going on in the Biden campaign and in the Biden administration.
Ronald Reagan was also one of the best speakers ever to be in office, and I covered Ronald Reagan from the time he was governor of California to his funeral, essentially. But and photographers are really a motley crew, and we don't like political speeches generally. I mean, and you have to listen to them over and over because you're out covering these guys. Reagan was the only guy, and even Gerald, I include Ford in this, who you could listen to, and he had such a great style. And but the core of it was he also had a really good campaign. I watched it happen. I mean, the Nixon campaign, you could take lessons from that. My first campaigns I covered were Nixon running for president, and they really had it down. And Nixon was an okay speaker, but Reagan, you had a combination of what you're saying, Linda, about the themes and a guy who could really deliver the goods. Biden is not in that category.
And Bill Galston, I'm going to bring you back. But before you say what you were thinking about, I would just ask you to recall that in 2012, and Obama was a good speaker, but he didn't rely on just himself. In 2012, they had a huge financial advantage over Romney, certainly at the in that interregnum before Romney was the nominee and got the big infusion of federal cash. And so they just buried him in negative ads, that he wasn't one of us, and he was he was killing grandmothers and all the rest of it. And, which we bitterly resented at the time, I don't mind saying. But they used their cash advantage. And I've been hearing for months about the great Biden cash advantage. And that's one thing to feel optimistic about. Where is it? I mean, and admittedly, I don't live in a swing state, so maybe that's why I'm not seeing it. Maybe that's it, but I'm not seeing it.
They say that they're spending it on a massive field operation, the likes of which have never been seen before, and that will substitute, for everything that they should be doing, but aren't. But I just want to make 2 comments on what Bill and or Linda have said, in agreement and also disagreement. First of all, I think they have decided what they're running on to a first approximation. It's abortion, threats to democracy, and Trump is an ogre. That's the campaign. And that's what you have been hearing over and over again. What you haven't been hearing so much is the sorts of issues that will really define the next term, if there is a next term. Trump actually has been much more forthcoming on that subject.
Yeah, putting all of us in jail.
Yeah. James Michael Curley, Redux, here we come. But what we've seen out of Biden, and this is just underscoring something that I think everybody has been saying, is a series of set speeches that are not part of a larger communication plan. The speeches themselves, in some cases, are more than serviceable. They're pretty good. But because they're one-offs, they just disappear without a political trace. And that is a violation of Campaign 101. It's political malpractice. And I think it reflects the fact that when you're in the Senate, that's what you do.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if all of your political instincts have been formed by more than 3 decades in the Senate, it is very difficult to revise those instincts and that playbook when you get to be president. And the longer you're in the Senate, I believe the harder it is to become a good president because your senatorial habits are so much more deeply ingrained. And here we are. And, Biden, I think, should have changed a long time ago, but he really hasn't. And it's not clear to me that the people around him know how to run a campaign that puts the message at the center and repeats it and amplifies it with a chorus of voices until it really reaches the country.
All right. Before everybody reaches for the hemlock, I would just underscore something that David said a few minutes ago, namely that Biden did show a capacity to change and be self-disciplined in 2020, which I noted as well. I mean, I remember seeing him many, decades ago where he just was like, he couldn't stop talking. He had no self-control. And he made gaffe after gaffe on the campaign trail. And he was much more disciplined and careful in 2020, more mellow, more, sort of statesmanlike. And so he did change. And that is maybe a glimmer of hope that, he can be subject to good advice and take good advice. So, David, what did you want to say?
I kind of take back one thing about Biden. One of the best speeches I ever heard him make was at the McCain Institute. And if you didn't see it, you should go back and look at it. And that was a combination of talking about a political rival, but someone he deeply admired. And he gave at John's funeral in Phoenix, he was there and gave remarks. But this was later as president, and it was filled with emotion, and it was really an incredible speech. I mean, it's in there.
Yeah.
I mean, he's one of the most empathetic guys I've ever photographed. Right before COVID hit the fan, I was up in New Hampshire photographing all the candidates, and I had pictures of him in a small town hall. And afterwards, he was talking to people who were sharing their painful experiences with him, and he listened to them, and they felt that he was somebody they could talk to. And during that talk, he talked about losing his son, Bo, which he does. But boy, it's like it goes right to the heart there. And the photos of him reflected that. And I mean, he's like a genuine human being. He's got good sides and bad sides. And the McCain speech, if he could do a couple of those before the election, that should help him get reelected.
And it's also worth saying that some of the main speeches of his presidency have been terrific, I thought. The speech that he gave about Ukraine and Israel and the importance of standing up for our allies and for what's right, those were terrific. He has risen to the occasion quite a few times. And I might have said this last week, and sorry for repeating myself, but it's important to bear in mind that this is somebody who got on a plane and went to Kyiv in the middle of a war. He got on a plane and went to Jerusalem after October 7th. No other American president has been so willing to put his body on the line there in a dangerous and fraught situation the way he has done. And I do think there is a core there of belief in this country, and frankly, there's a lot riding on making sure that that voters recognize that fundamental difference: a lunatic, sociopath, selfish criminal, or a flawed, elderly, but basically very decent and patriotic president.
Well, Mona,
So that's
I agree with
yeah.
I agree with you completely, but here's the problem. A campaign is not an occasion that you rise to. Right? It is, it is something that requires a lot more organization, relying on other people, discipline, and repetition. And if it were an occasion, I have total confidence that he would rise to it. It's not.
Well, maybe there are.
So we shall see.
Yeah,
I'm as
yeah.
strongly in favor of him as you are. Okay, I'll shut
Yeah.
up.
All right. With that, let us turn to our highlight or lowlight of the week. We'll start with Linda Chavez.
I'm going to go with a highlight and an important piece this week about something very important that is happening in the next few days. It's from the Substack newsletter Persuasion, and it's called Mexican Democracy Hangs in the Balance by Enrique Krauss. I am always surprised and disappointed at how little Americans seem to care about what goes on south of our border. We spend a
Or
lot
north.
of time, or north. Yeah, but south of our border is even more important. But it's a big. I mean, it's more important in certain ways. It certainly affects us much more. Mexico is our single largest trading partner as of 2023. The population is about half the size of the United States, and it has enormous problems. There's an election coming up, and AMLO, who is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the president, he cannot succeed himself under the Constitution in Mexico, but he has handpicked his successor, a woman named Claudia Sheinbaum. And this is worrisome for a number of reasons. The PRI, which was the sort of single-party rule for many, many years after the Mexican Revolution, there was a common practice of the PRI leader picking the next successor. And so it's continuing that. But at least according to Mr. Krauss, the worrisome thing here is that even though there will be another person who might be the figurehead, should she be elected, AMLO will continue to run Mexico. And this is a real backward step in terms of democracy in Mexico. And his policy, his sort of, hugs but not bullets attitude towards organized crime, which has led to the death of more than 31,000 people a year under his rule in Mexico, threatens us in lots of ways. The way in which the cartels control border areas, control traffic, including traffic of humans. All of this affects us generally. So I hope people take a look at this. I hope we are watching. I hope the Biden administration is focused as well on what's going to happen because it's important.
Thank you for that. Bill Kristol.
Thinking about our discussion of the trial, maybe I'll say just a word about best and worst. We worry a lot about the guardrails, the institutions, how much damage has been done already over the last bunch of years, some before Trump, but especially in the Trump years. And on the one hand, one looks at the situation, the Supreme Court sitting on this case now for over 2 months, that to make sure that in effect that we don't get the January 6th trial this year, apparently, and behavior honestly, of Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, family. It's not really a wonderful reassurance about our institutions. And then Judge Cannon in Florida, really pretty unbelievable, slow walking of the classified documents case on what you think, oof, man, these institutions we're so proud of are not entirely in great shape. But then I've got to say the New York City trial was pretty impressive. I mean, there's New York City, which is not, which is a complicated and disorganized place, very political and all this. And maybe Alvin Bragg said a couple of things he shouldn't have a couple of years ago when he was running for office. But the actual, so far as I can tell, Linda, I did not watch it. I'd stay glued to my TV every day. So you would know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was dignified. It was competent. It seemed fair. The judge seemed to, I noticed this somewhere recently. One of the Trump people said, he only accepts the prosecution's objections, not the defense. It's actually totally false. It was sort of 50-50. Most of the lawyers I've talked to think it was a very, serious, sober trial. We'll see what the jury does. But, so there's a way in which you look at these two, at the split screen of Judge Cannon in Florida and then the trial in New York, and you think, I don't know, some of our institutions are pretty impressive and the rule of law is strong. And then you look elsewhere and you think, it doesn't take that much to corrupt it, though.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I haven't followed it as closely as Linda, but I did read an account in the paper this morning that I'll just add because I loved this line. So apparently the lead prosecutor, Mr. Steinglass, in his summation was rebutting the notion that, that the whole case has to fall apart because Michael Cohen has lied. And so he had a colorful way of making the point. He said, look, we didn't choose Michael Cohen as our witness. We didn't go to the witness store and pick up Michael Cohen. We have Michael Cohen as a witness because Donald Trump surrounds himself by liars and frauds. And those are the kinds of people that are going to be in a position to testify about him. So I thought that was the witness store. I thought was a nice,
just
line.
one more footnote. I mean, we're so social media. No one has an attention span of longer than 30 seconds anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm a little guilty of that myself. This is a trial in which, if I'm not mistaken, the defense counsel, Todd Blanche, spoke for 2.5 hours, maybe on Tuesday morning. And then the prosecutor spoke for 4 hours, I think.
5 hours, I think.
And some rhetoric, but actually pretty detailed legal arguments, evidentiary arguments, slides. I mean, that's sort of impressive, right? I mean, that's how a trial is supposed to work. It was not some guy giving a stem winder for 15 minutes, playing on everyone's emotions,
Right. Yeah, good point. It's one of the reasons that I like trials better than social media as a way of getting at truth. Better than social media, better than cable news. At least there are rules of evidence, and the jury has to decide on the basis of what they are given, not what they would prefer to think. So, and there's even, while we're on the subject, there's even a story that the Trump people, which was in the Bulwark, that the Trump defense is hoping for a hung jury based on the eye contact that one particular juror has been making with the defense. And, that could well be that they have somebody on the jury who's very pro-Trump. But I would say two things about that. One is we don't know whether that person is going to be on the final jury of 12, right? Because they have the alternates who are also sitting, and we won't know until the end who's actually going to be deliberating. Well, I guess we know now, but it didn't know before today. And then the other thing is that in a jury deliberation, as we all know from watching 12 Angry Men and lots of other, fictional depictions, but also non-fictional ones, you often have a holdout. And almost every time the holdout is persuaded by the others to go along with the majority. It's very rare to have hung juries because you have one person who won't budge. It does happen, but it's rare because most of the time when it's 11-1, the one says, okay, I concede. Anyway, just for what it's worth. Bill Galston.
I have a highlight and a lowlight. My highlight is someone I consider to be one of the great statesmen of our time, Jens Stoltenberg, who has led NATO for almost a decade. And he always manages to say what needs to be said when it needs to be said. And his statement yesterday about the need to take the shackles associated with American weapons off the government of Ukraine is another example of why I fear he's irreplaceable. My low light of the week has to do with a city that's only 45-minute drive from where I'm sitting, namely the city of Baltimore. Front page story in the New York Times this week. In the past 6 years, the city of Baltimore has lost 6,000 people to drug overdoses. 6,000 people in one medium-sized city in 6 years. This isn't a problem. This is a crisis. And if there were more time, I would add more information about what's going on in Maryland's largest city. We really have to get to work as a state and as a country. This is intolerable.
Thank you for that. David Kennerly.
I'll give you the high and low in one column today by Dana Milbank at the Washington Post, quoting Todd Blanche, who said during his summation, every campaign in this country is a conspiracy, a group of people who are working together to help somebody win. And Dana quoted that and then said, what is a conspiracy but a synonym for teamwork? So, I mean, that's how ridiculous that statement was. But Dana called it out, and Rita's column today in the Washington Post is excellent.
Thank you for that. All right. I just wanted to note that the man the Republicans are nominating for president is doubling down on the outlaw persona now. And he invited 2 rappers on stage at his New York event who have been indicted for conspiracy, not to rig an election, but murder. He invited them up on stage, and one of them said, "Make America Great Again." He also promised to commute the sentence of a notorious drug dealer in an attempt to garner the approval of certain libertarians when he was at that convention. He is now not just saying this trial that I was subjected to was crooked or is a conspiracy by the Biden administration. He is now taking the view that he's on the side of the really fine murderers in this country who are being unfairly treated by a system. It's just beyond belief that that's where we are. And in contrast to what some have said, I really still believe that most people don't know. Most people who are thinking of voting for Trump are unaware of these things. And people say, oh, you can't win by saying orange man bad. I'm still not persuaded that that's the case. I really am not. All right. With that, I want to thank David Hume Kennerly for joining us with that great description of your personal experience and also the great historical insight you bring. So thank you for joining us. I want to thank Bill Kristol for sitting in today, and of course, my regulars. Our producer is Jim Swift. Beg to Differ will return next week as every week.